However, one goal for the Women's Institute at Russell Sage College is to address those gaps, to revise historical perspectives, to refine them and enrich them. And that's what we've done throughout this series, aided by the 18 wonderful contributors that we've been fortunate enough to host, a distinguished group of scholars, filmmakers, civil rights attorneys, authors, consultants, social scientists, politicians, and activists. So I look forward to learning something new and important, and to following tonight's program by reading Sisters in Spirit, continuing to follow the work of all three of our guest speakers. And now to introduce those speakers, I'm pleased to present Shelley Calabrese, the Interim Director of the Women's Institute. Thank you for being here tonight.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the fifth and final event in our Deeds Not Words series, where we have explored the complex history and enduring significance of the women's suffrage movement. We have touched on topics ranging from gender equity, contemporary issues and voting rights, women in politics and activism, and the history of Black women and the vote. In tonight's panel discussion, the role of Indigenous peoples in women's suffrage, we will shed light on the lesser-known history of the movement, where Native women were highly influential on the early suffrage activism and how they helped shape the vision of women as equals. Before we get started, I want to take a moment to thank Joan Clifford, our Executive Director of the Alumni Association, who has been an invaluable partner and instrumental in bringing this series to life. It has been an incredible journey for me, and I'm thankful for the experience and all that I've learned along the way. And now it's my great honor to introduce Michelle Shenandoah of the Oneida Indian Nation Wolf Clan of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and historian and contemporary feminist scholar Sally Roche Wagner, here with us to discuss how Native American women inspired the women's rights movement. Michelle Shenandoah is the founder and CEO of Rematriation Magazine, a multimedia storytelling platform for Indigenous women to reclaim voice and identity and share traditional perspectives with the public at large. She and her husband co-founded Indigenous Concepts Consulting to incorporate Indigenous perspective into the mainstream and raise a new consciousness in business and media paradigms. Shenandoah served as an economic and governance strategist for Indigenous nations with Bluestone Strategy Group, and worked in the nonprofit sector for the American Indian College Fund and United Nations NGO Children of the Earth. She served over 4 years on the board of directors as president for the Seven Dancers Coalition, a sanctioned nonprofit by the DOJ and the Office of Violence Against Women. She lives in her ancestral homelands with her husband and their 4 beautiful children. Dr. Sally Roche Wagner was awarded one of the first doctorates in the country for her work in women's studies, and is a founder of one of the first college-level women's studies programs in the United States. She has taught women's studies courses for 50 years and currently serves as an adjunct faculty member in the Syracuse University Renee Crown University Honors Program. She wrote the faculty guide for Not for Ourselves Alone, Ken Burns's documentary on Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, and has appeared in that film and numerous history films and radio programs. Dr. Wagner was selected as one of 21 leaders for the 21st century by Women's E-News in 2015 and serves on the New York Suffrage Centennial Commission. A prolific author, Dr. Wagner's work includes The Women's Suffrage Movement, with a foreword by Gloria Steinem, Sisters in Spirit, Haudenosaunee Influence on Early American Feminists, and the recently released young readers' books, We Want Equal Rights. Tonight's panel discussion will be moderated by Russell Sage College professor Gail Scawaneo-Morse of the Mohawk Nation of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and member of the Wolf Clan. Dr. Morse is a professor of counseling and community psychology and director of the graduate psychology programs at Russell Sage College. Her work in education, research, and clinical practice highlights the connections between mental health, community health, and environmental stewardship. The American Psychological Association's Society for the Psychology of Women named Dr. Morse as the 2020 recipient of the Sweetgrass Award, which honors a psychology professional who advances Indigenous values through outstanding professionalism and service. Before I turn things over to Dr. Morris, I want to quickly mention that for the question and answer portion of the event, you will use the tab marked Q&A at the bottom of your screen. Please feel free to submit questions as you think of them, and we will get through as many as possible in the time allotted. Welcome, Dr. Morris.
Thank you. Welcome everyone to this meeting. I'm excited to be part of this presentation on the role of Indigenous women and women's suffrage. But first, I'd like to start by acknowledging my relatives, the Haudenosaunee, as the custodians of this traditional land where I live and work and where many of us are actually right now. I pay my respects to the elders past and present and the 7 generations yet to come. And I respect our continued connection to the land and our communities. When most of us meet in Haudenosaunee territory, we often start with an address that is quite long, but I won't start us that way, but I will start with the most important part, which is the refrain. Our address reminds us to give thanks to the natural world, from our 4-legged brothers and sisters to Grandmother Moon, and from our medicine plants to the thunder beings. I will start by saying the most important part. Aguego, aska, odidawa wenune, ogwa negunla. So I said that in the language of the Ganyagahage Mohawk people. And it means all of us together as one, put our minds together as one. In this way, we can do the important work that we are put forth in front of us today. I'm delighted to welcome my Lani Oguaho, which means Wolf Clan sister, Michelle Shenandoah, who presided over a wonderful bringing together of the women of the Haudenosaunee and other Indigenous women this weekend, called the Kindling the Fire of Our Sisterhood to Be a Human Being. It was inspiring. I felt part of something that was bigger than me. It was so important. I was fortunate to attend. I'd also like to welcome Sally Roche Wagner, whose book I luckily read this summer. So I was so excited that she was going to be here today. I read it with great interest and delight. So Michelle, I invite you to share with us your wisdom. Thank you for being here.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Seguli. Greetings to everyone. I hope this evening that you are at peace. Galuhia Nuas Nyongets. My Ungwehue Oneida name is Galuhia Nuas. It means that she's fond of the sky. And but you can call me Michelle Shenandoah. And I'm really happy and honored to be here tonight. Thank you to Russell Sage for the staff and faculty and administration who have invited us here. It's an honor to be here tonight and also to be speaking alongside Sally Roche Wagner. And it's always such a pleasure to be speaking with her at these events and now in this virtual reality that we are in. And so thank you everyone for being here tonight, for taking the time away from your family and responsibilities that you have and taking this moment to hear about the perspective of the Haudenosaunee women and the influence that we had upon the suffragists. And as I like to start out and tell people that no, there's a number of things I can start out by saying, but I think it's really important to note that the perspective I share with you is a Haudenosaunee perspective. And I want to share with you who we are as a people. Oftentimes people will ask me about the history, where they can find, references to these histories. And often I point them to Sally Roche Wagner, to her research. But what I can provide for you is a nice insight as to who we are as Haudenosaunee people, as our oral histories are very much alive and present. And that oral history is a tradition that has been passed on through many, many, many generations of our people and is actually really quite valid. And a lot of academics, even scientists have looked within our oral histories and basically verified the information that we share. So it gets passed from generation to generation. There's many stories about who we are as our culture, as a people. And so what I'm presenting to you tonight is that oral history. In addition to that, I'm also presenting parts of my own personal perspective as a Haudenosaunee woman. I don't represent the Haudenosaunee perspective in its entirety, but I do my best to try to represent the stories from our people. And so with that, I'd like to share some slides with you. Let's see if I can get this up on the screen for everybody. Okay, let's see. Oh, sorry about that. Let's see. It started backwards for me. So you're getting to see all my slides. It just gave it all away. I'm just kidding. No, I didn't. But here we are. We're starting in the beginning. And I think one of the things that's really important when we talk about, women, Haudenosaunee women, there's this narrative that has been told mostly by non-Haudenosaunee people that Haudenosaunee women were equal or are equal to men. And I think it's really important for everyone to understand that there is an inherent flaw in that statement, in that Haudenosaunee women actually hold an elevated status within our culture, within our societies, within our nations. And actually, it's men that have to work to be in that space of women because there is a certain reverence that's held for us as life givers. And it's really quite very different than the European Christian worldview, which Sally, I'm sure, will point to and does a really great job explaining. That's almost a complete reversal on that worldview and that lens. And so what I'd like to do is to take you through a little bit of a journey so that you can understand this lens. And so what is up here on the screen is the Hiawatha Belt, and this is representative of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. And it's really important because it's going to geographically situate you to where you are at currently. And if you look all the way from the right and then go all the way to the left. So starting on the right is the eastern door of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and that's the Mohawk Nation. And each one of those squares and symbols represents one of our nations. We are 6 nations, but originally we were 5. So you start out on the eastern side, the keepers of the eastern door, the Mohawk Nation. You move a little bit more west, you have the Oneida Nation. In the center, you have our Central Fire, which is the capital of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, which is the Onondaga Nation. You move a little bit further, and you have the Cayuga Nation, and then you have on the far left is the keepers of the Western Door, the Seneca Nation. And so right there, that represents our entire Confederacy and how we are all connected as relatives, as brother nations or sister nations to each other. And as you can see on each end, you can see there's a white line that threads through that connects each of them. And on the end, those white lines represent our openness for others coming to join us and to come and reside in this space of peace that we have been living under for over 1,000 years. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy has the oldest continuous form of democracy anywhere in the world, which has come to influence the democracy that you know today, and has also come to influence the Constitution, the US Constitution, and form of government as well that you know. Now, we have a very limited amount of time tonight, and there's plenty of history and stories that I could share with you to help you to understand that context and understanding the form of your government, the form of representation. But much of it is actually based on the Haudenosaunee system of governance and how we've structured ourselves and how we've been structured for over 1,000 years. So that's really important. That's something that's really not shared in history books. And maybe my explanation tonight that I give to you will help you to understand maybe some of the reasons why that is not shared. So going in, back to the influence on the women's suffrage, what I'd like to do is to give you a perspective, a worldview, Haudenosaunee worldview, and understanding why it is that we are centered around the female, around the feminine, that our worldview is very, very feminine, grounded within a matrilineal worldview. And this is what came to influence the suffragists. So let me take you on that journey as soon as I can figure out how to move my slides here. So the first question that I like to ask everyone is, where are your feet right now? Where are your feet? Whose land are you standing on? Because there is some treaty or some wrongdoing that allowed you to be where you're at right now. For your house to be there, for your school to be there, for the buildings to be there. There is something that allowed you to be there. And it came down through a series of negotiations or land takings by the government or by the states that created an opportunity and a space, rightfully or wrongfully, in order for colonial settlement to be established where it's at today. And so Russell Sage being situated on Mohawk territory, you are in the lands of the keepers of the Eastern Door. And it's always really important to be mindful of those past relationships, those past negotiations, or even past wrongdoings that allowed for colonial presence to be there today, because there are relationships that either need to be nurtured and fostered according to treaty, or there are wrongs that need to be made right. And in this time of great social justice and change, I encourage you to investigate and to look into that history so that you know where you stand today. So the Haudenosaunee specifically, being a matrilineal culture, our women are of great importance to us. So we celebrate when, women come, when female babies are born. There's a great cause for celebration. And in that relationship to the land that my previous slide just pointed to, there's a specific language to the land wherever you travel in the Americas that is indigenous. So there's a language that associates with where you're at. So just like I showed you that Hiawatha belt, that belt itself, lays out not just the geography, but the understanding of our nations and the understanding of all the interconnectedness and relationships that we have. And even deeper than that is knowing that the women really are the core to our governance and to our decision-making within our cultures. And so when I talk about the language of the land, it's important to understand what that language is, because as we're now even in places of ecological crisis, the indigenous peoples of whatever lands that you're in within the world hold essential knowledge to that land where you live that is key to understanding how to take care of the land today, because it varies all around the world. And the indigenous peoples who've been the stewards of those lands for time immemorial know that language. And so it's important to align yourself with that knowledge so that you know how to live where you're at today. The Haudenosaunee creation story goes back before, it goes back, that's everyone's Genesis story, somewhere in all people's histories, there's some type of creation story, right? And so yours might be related to religion, it might be related to science. And for Haudenosaunee, ours goes back to another realm in the universe called Sky World. And there is a story of Sky Woman. There's a story before creation, and that has its own story unto itself. But in order for us to come here and be human beings, begins with the story of Sky Woman, where she lived in this other realm, and she fell through a hole that was there in the sky, in Sky World, and fell down through the universe, and has a whole other story about her fall and her descent. But when she left and when she was falling, she was pregnant, and she was carrying a child with her. And as she was on her way here to the world, there was only water on the earth. There wasn't any land, and there were water animals that were here, and they could see her falling. They could see her coming, and they knew that they had to help her, because if she were to hit the water, then she would die. And they knew that. So you can see these birds that came up to break her fall and to bring her down to the earth. And all the animals had to decide and figure out how they would help her. And eventually it was a turtle that came up and lent its back for her to be able to land on. And then the animals decided among themselves as well, to bring her some earth that she could then use. And that's a whole other story as well. We have lots and lots of stories. But the important thing is she took that earth and she danced upon it. And she danced on this earth. And as she did that, the turtle's back began to grow. And so you will hear, particularly among Haudenosaunee people and some other related nations, will talk about Turtle Island. And Turtle Island is the land that we, refer to today. That's how we still call, the earth is Turtle Island. And so Sky Woman gave birth to a daughter who gave birth. Then the daughter gave birth to twin boys, who then created the world, much of the world that we see around us. And one of these twin boys created human beings, right? And so this twin, who is a right-handed twin, became our creator. But you can see our story begins with a woman. And while there's much more that goes into our creation story, it's essential to understand that Sky Woman is really the one who has led the way in order for human beings to be here on Earth. Through that process and through her journey, she ends up becoming the moon, and she ends up watching over all of creation, and she's in charge. Grandmother Moon, as we refer to her, is in charge of the women. She's in charge of the waters. She's in charge of the children coming to the earth. And she's in charge of all of nature. She is the one who's watching over all of us. She's the one who really is the leader of women. She cycles every 28 days. We cycle every 28 days. There's a very, very strong connection that we have to her. One of the things that I will share right now that's not in my slide directly, but is a picture of the sun. And the men are guided by the sun. And what does the sun do? The sun shows up every day. The sun brings its warmth and brings our ability to grow. And that's the responsibility that men have, is to be able to show up every day, bring that warmth and that smiles to our faces and to our families. So as you can see already, there's quite a bit that's involved that is in this feminine perspective. Her daughter, who was born, did end up passing away during childbirth when she gave birth to those twin boys. And her body went into the earth, and from that many different food plants grew from her body. And so you'll also hear people refer to Mother Earth, right? And that's because her body went into the ground and making that earth. So again, another feminine perspective. So you travel forward a little bit more in time. Our creator had made human beings. That was the one twin. And eventually, with time, people began to die. And imagine being the first human beings and never knowing what death is. It's, I'm sure we've all had that experience of loss, or know others who've had that loss. And you're overcome and stricken with a type of grief that, people can't see, they can't hear, they can't speak. They're just sort of, in a cloud of grief. And a dream came to a young man, a young boy actually, that was instructed to ask all of our elder women from these various family groups to go to the water and to describe to go and see and come back and tell the first animal that they saw in the morning by the water and what side of the water that it was on. And so these elder women went down, they described the animal that they saw, and that ended up becoming their clan. Now, 2 women had gone down and both seen a bear, and on each side, on both sides of the water. So the 2 women and the young boy had to make a decision as to, which where the bears would become situated, because as each woman came back and responded saying what side of the river that she saw the animal, determined where that family would then sit within the framework of our longhouses. And so all clans, all particular clans sit on one side, and then another set of clans sit on the other side. And so now where would the bears sit? Because they both saw a bear, and there can only be one bear clan on one side. So you see these 2 elder women and the young boy making a decision about where the bears would sit. Now that 3-part decision-making process that they went through is a process that we continued to use for thousands of years. And that 3-part decision-making process, you will also see reflected in your decision-making processes within the US government as well. There's 3 sides to our houses and where our clans will sit. And the original purpose of those clans were to help each other during times of death and grief. But it became part of our governing process and how we made decisions. So the clans would make decisions and pass them over the fire back and forth across to the 3 sides. And that's something that you can see reflected in the US governance today, right? So it's important. I tell you these stories because they have relevance to understanding that influence that we had on those founding fathers and their formation of the US Constitution. So those clan systems, when you trace it back, now as you'll see, Dr. Gail Morse and myself are both members of the Wolf Clan. So we can trace our lineage back through the line of our women, our mothers, her mother, and all of our grandmothers on our female side, all the way back to that time of early human beings, to that first elder woman who walked down to the water and saw that animal on the different side of the river. And that's really, really important because we identify ourselves by who our mother is. We gain our mother's nation and we gain our mother's clan. You always know who your mother is. There's no questioning who your mother is. Now, I can't say that historically is always the same for fathers, right? But in a patriarchy, you become the possession of your father by taking his last name, and your mother, through marriage, historically in law, would have become his property. And so that is a very, very big distinction in terms of who we are as Haudenosaunee women. Now, what becomes important is that those first women became our clan mothers among our nations. And the clan mothers are the ones who oversee the well-being of her clan. That's everyone who's within her family, born within that line. And she becomes their caretaker. And she's the one who really has the connection to the community. She's paying attention to their needs. She's listening and counseling with them to, take care of community issues. And eventually, many, many, many generations later, when the Haudenosaunee Confederacy was formed, and then we had chiefs that were then added to the system of women clan mothers, she would then take those issues to the chiefs, and the chiefs then would take the direction of their clan mothers and meet among other chiefs within our villages or within our nations and among the whole Confederacy in order to make decisions for the Confederacy. But the important thing is that our chiefs must follow the direction of their clan mothers. They are not to act outside of what her directions are. He is to be the eyes and the ears of the people. And so he, has to be there as a representative of the people, as a voice of the people. Does this all sound familiar? And if he starts to act in his own self-interest, his clan mother actually has the right to remove him from his leadership position. That's the right that she has. And I think that's really important, because when you look at the system that was created under the US Constitution, this central role of women was left out. It was a deliberate omission, because remember, the colonists who had settled here, they're coming from a very, very different worldview, where women did not have any rights. Sally will speak more to that. And knowing that our Haudenosaunee women had absolute authority was something that I don't think that they could digest. There's many instances within the record where lots of European, leaders who were meeting with our people were beside themselves that were women were present at these meetings. It was just something that they couldn't comprehend. But one thing that they didn't understand was that the chief was just the voice for the people. He was there representing them. So as they were meeting with our chiefs, a lot of these European settlers were thinking that the chiefs were in charge and that they were the decision makers, and didn't know that it actually was the women who were in charge of our communities. So we were the ones who decided if we went to war. We're the ones who were in charge of our economies, which was our food systems. And we had full autonomy over our bodies, over our minds, over our homes, our longhouses. When a man and woman would get married, a man would actually move into the longhouse of his wife. That meant he had to make every elder woman in that longhouse content with his behavior, because that meant if he were to act out of line and upset the women within the longhouse, he had a lot of, he had a lot of work to do to make things right. And if the couple were to ever separate, he had to leave, and all he could leave with were the clothes on his back, right? And any of his belongings that he had were just placed outside the door. That's it. So he didn't have a right to his children or taking his children. They belonged to the mother and to her clan. And so this is all really important because this gives you a context to understanding what these suffragists saw when they came to settle in the lands of what is now called New York State. That's really, really important to understand. Let's see here. I'm just trying to pay attention to the time. So let's see here. I apologize. I have to plug in my computer very quickly. I should have had it plugged in from the beginning, but there we go. All right. So Sally, was there anything else you wanted me to comment on before I turned it over to you? Oh, you're on mute.
That is so rich and thorough, Michelle. Thank you.
I know that there's a lot more that I could say.
Yes.
I'm just trying to be mindful of our time together tonight. So Sally, I'd like to hand it over to you. I do have, I can add more to when we get into our question and answer. So yeah, thank you. I'll stop sharing this here.
Got to unmute. Sally, I would like to invite you to share your wisdom with us now.
Oh, thank you. Well, I want to also thank you so much for the honor of being with you tonight. The students and the faculty and the administration, and it is always an honor to work with Michelle and Gail. I feel like I've made a new friend in this process. I also want to thank you, Shelley, because this has been so well organized. So I speak to you from Onondaga territory. The Onondaga have been the stewards of this land and continue to guide us in the ways in which we should live, as do the Haudenosaunee. I want to just pick up on what Michelle said about the polar opposite, because I think I grew up not knowing my own history. And you may all know this. If you do, I apologize for giving you a refresher course. But the things that surprised me to learn was the way in which women in the United States, once they married, and this is after the Revolution, they ceased to exist legally. Now, it wasn't just that they didn't have rights. That would have been a step up. The founding fathers determined that what they would do was to adopt the Blackstone Code of common law, which had recently been adopted in England or determined in England. And even though Abigail Adams warned John, do not do this, or we are determined to foment a rebellion, the founding fathers did. Now, the Blackstone Code really creates the legal position of women. Once you marry, you cease to exist legally. Now, of course, you couldn't vote, you couldn't serve on a jury, you couldn't sue or be sued. You had no legal identity. It went beyond that. You had no right to any belongings, property, possessions that you brought into the marriage or that you gained in work or inheritance during the course of the marriage. Everything became your husband's. You did not have the right to the children that you gave birth to. A husband in the state of New York, and this was true in many states, could will away an unborn child on his deathbed. He would write in his will that when the child was born, it would be given to someone else as the guardian. Mother would give birth, the will would be read. She might not even be aware of what he had determined, likely would not. And that child, when the will is read, is taken out of her arms and given to its rightful owner. Husbands had the legal right to beat their wives as long as they did not inflict permanent damage. Now, the way that suffragist Matilda Jocelyn Gage explains this, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton basically sees the same process, is that common law is based on canon law, and canon law is based on the Bible. The second creation story in Genesis is the one of Eve. The first creation story is that God creates man and woman equally. But that one didn't get much currency. The one that really was carried on was that woman brought evil into the world. Eve ate the apple. I think Elizabeth Cady Stanton put it this way. She said, you take away the apple, you take away the woman, you take away the snake, and you pulled the rug out from under Christian theology. Because if there is no sin, there is no need for a savior. So women are responsible for bringing evil into the world. And Genesis says, because of the sin of Eve, woman is to give birth in pain and sorrow and to be under the authority of her husband. And it's not just the Old Testament, that follows all the way through to St. Paul, as Stanton documented in her Woman's Bible, and Gage wrote about. St. Paul, same thing. Woman is to be obedient to man. Now, here's the logic behind this. If you are to be obedient, and your salvation depends on that because your obedience is God ordained, then what happens if you die in a state of disobedience to your husband? You know where you're going to go, and you know whose fault it is. It's not yours. He's responsible for your behavior. So he, if he loves you, has the responsibility to ensure your obedience, even if it means physically forcing that obedience. Husbands had the legal right to rape their wives. Those laws continued on the books. Rape is an act of unlawful sexual intercourse with someone other than the wife of the perpetrator. That was the basis of rape law in almost every state up until the second wave of feminism. I remember in 1980 sitting in the California State Senate when the first marital rape law was being considered. And I remember when one of the senators stood up and said, oh, come on, guys, if you can't rape your wife, who can you rape? And the Senate exploded in laughter. That was in 1980. So that legacy continuing on, that was the position of women. No possessions, no personhood. You simply did not exist once you married. And so the push uphill was not for rights, it was to be recognized as an independent, sovereign human being. Now, these women, can you imagine being a white woman and seeing the world that Michelle described? Here's a couple of examples of that. Lucretia Mott spent a month in the summer of 1848 with Seneca women at the Cattaraugus community, and she saw the women being absolutely equal participants in the discussion about whether the Seneca would, in that community, would continue on with their traditional system or whether they would adopt a US type of constitution. Women were absolutely active parts of that discussion. She'd never seen that before. she saw the women plan the strawberry ceremony while she was there. And this was at a time when women could not speak from the pulpit in any denomination in the United States. She was a Quaker and she could speak in meeting because there was no pulpit. Everybody could speak while they were in the Quaker meeting. But she describes that summer the fight that is going on among the progressive Hicksites that she's part of, that Quaker group. And they're really working for the equality of women. So it's not perfect in her world. She comes to Waterloo, and the women, she's with 3 of her Quaker friends, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton comes, and she brings to that meeting, that informal meeting where they plan the Seneca Falls Convention, that world that she has just observed, been part of, spent time with for a month. Now, how important was that? Well, in my women's suffrage anthology, this book that came out with Penguin Classics last year, I have the one account of Seneca Falls that I found of the convention and the planning of it. And it's in a letter that she wrote to the Liberator, the anti-slavery paper. And she's describing her whole summer. 3 paragraphs describe her experience at Cattaraugus, and 1 paragraph describes the Seneca Falls Convention. Now, I don't know that's the relative importance she gives to each event, but I think that that gives us a sense of that's what she brought, and that's the energy that fueled, in many ways, that first local women's rights convention. I want to just jump around and take you to a few other events, if I might. Let's go to 1888 and the International Council of Women. An ethnographer, early anthropologist Alice Fletcher, is addressing the thousands of women that have gathered from all over the Western world for the first time on United States soil. She shares a story of being with a group of Native women. These are from the Omaha Nation in what we would say the Midwest. And one of the women gave away a horse. And Alice said, without thinking, I said, hadn't you better check with your husband? She said, the merriment with which my statement was met, I forgot just for a minute that I was not with white women. I can only imagine these Oneida women thinking, yeah, is this woman from another planet? I don't know. Where'd she get this idea? Why would she come up with that question? Seems so foolish. And she felt foolish. She talks about the discussions with Native women, and she said, they're very aware of what's going on. And they are telling me that as an Indian woman, I was free, and I will lose my rights if I have to come under United States law. And they thought it was the writing on the wall. And then she talks about talking to Native men. One of them I identified with Sitting Bull. And they say to her, she reports, they're worried about what's going to happen to them if they come under US law, but they're more worried about what's going to happen to the women because they will lose their position as Indians, but they will lose their position and be treated as badly as white women. They'll lose their position as women. One of the things she recounts is if a man abused a woman, her clan or Taoshpe extended family, the men of her family would make sure that wouldn't happen again. And she said under United States law, those clan family members that take whatever means are necessary to ensure her safety, if they use any physical force to do it, they're going to be arrested. But the perpetrator of the violence if he's the husband, is going to face nothing. The difference between the native law and the white law is that absolute total difference. So this is all the women's leaders from around the world who hear this story and who begin to understand, if they don't already. Let me take you to 1891 and the National Council of Women. This is the women gathering from throughout the United States. It's the first major women's rights or just women's organization. And Elizabeth Cady Stanton has an address on the matriarchate. And in it, she goes through nation after nation of Native women, Indigenous women, and the positions that they hold, the leadership positions, the ways in which they're at the center of their cultures, as Michelle described, and a couple of specific things she talks about the Haudenosaunee. Michelle mentioned the process of the man being outside the longhouse if he misbehaves himself. Well, Elizabeth Cady Stanton describes that. She is under the gun because she has advocated divorce for what she calls loveless and dangerous marriages, where a woman's life is at stake if she stays with her husband. She is called a heretic because at that time, most denominations, Christian denominations, said that marriage was not a civil agreement between two human beings. It was a covenant with God, and a covenant with God cannot be broken. So if she was calling for divorce, she was clearly calling for the destruction of the family. She was going up against God, if you will. So she describes in this 1891 talk divorce Haudenosaunee style. And she says, exactly as Michelle said, if a husband misbehaves himself, he will find his belongings outside of the longhouse. And that's the end of it, unless there's somebody who can intervene on his behalf. And then she talks about how the clan mother, and the language she uses is a language that still fires feminists to this day, although it's not taken in context. She says that the clan mother has the right, as Michelle said, to remove the chief, but she uses the language to cut off his horns. And the removal of the symbol of his responsibility that she has placed on him, she will remove. Remember, at one time I was doing a talk for an Elizabeth Cady Stanton birthday tea with one of the clan mothers from Onondaga, and I gave that quote, the cut off his horns, the right to cut off his horns, and that white feminist audience went berserk. They went wild over it. And then Audrey got up and talked about how she had the responsibility to remove the sanctum if she needed to. If, as Michelle said, he didn't carry out his responsibilities as the voice of the people, listening to the eyes and the ears of the clan mother. And that she said that would be the saddest thing I could ever imagine, because it would mean that we were so out of balance. And afterwards, I was, how do we figure out, how do we think about the difference between rights and responsibilities? Audrey and I were talking about it, and what we came up with was that rights are what you talk about in their absence. Responsibilities are what you have when you have achieved a balance, a gender balance, a balance of responsibilities. So, well, I need to talk about Matilda Jocelyn Gage, obviously, because she is the one who was the most influenced. She was a major theoretician of the 19th century movement, and she got written out of history almost completely because for two reasons. And, you know, I always tell people you should never believe what I say. Matilda said, you need to think for yourself. So, you know, there are resources that I've written that you could track down the evidence for this. But after, you know, 40 years of trying to figure out what caused her to be written out of history, it's two reasons. One is that she went up against the Christian church in Woman, Church, and State. She names Christianity as the foundation of woman's oppression. And then correspondingly, she also says it is that the oppression of women is the foundation of Christianity, of Christian theology, because if there wasn't a sin of Eve, there would be no need for a Christ, for a Savior. And so she and Stanton were agreed on that. And pretty much they were both critics of Christianity in its role in oppressing women. But the other thing is, Gage gets written out of history, I believe, because of her writing about the superior position of Haudenosaunee women, superior to her own. In 1875, she did a series of front page articles for the New York Evening Post. And she is at that point president of the National Woman Suffrage Association, the Gage Stanton Anthony organization. She's the president. And the articles are introduced by the editor saying it is only appropriate that the president of the suffrage movement is writing about the superior position of Indian women. And she proceeds to do that. In 1878, there is a bill introduced into the New York legislature that would give the vote to Indian men. Matilda Jocelyn Gage is editing the major newspaper, the official newspaper of the National Woman Suffrage Association, editing it here in Syracuse. She's the publisher, the editor, and she writes an editorial in support of a decision that the chiefs, the Council of Chiefs, meeting in Onondaga, as she said, they have done since before Columbus. And she said, what they have said is, we are citizens of our own nation, of our own nations, the 6 nations that Michelle identified. And we will not accept citizenship in New York State or in the United States because we are citizens of our own sovereign nations. This is a suffragist writing an editorial in support of the chiefs. And then she goes on to describe, she says, they are sovereign nations every bit as much as Canada and Mexico. And to try to force citizenship on them would be like forcing it on Canadians and Mexicans. Justice to the Indians requires living up to the treaties that we have. And it is the greatest hypocrisy that this government that will not give the vote to its own women citizens who are demanding it is attempting to force citizenship on Indian men, the better to steal their lands. This continues on. Her major work, Woman, Church, and State, in 1893, the first chapter is on the matriarchate. And she describes the Haudenosaunee in detail, women having responsibilities for the land, being the agriculturalists. She describes women having the final say in matters of war and peace, as Michelle has talked about. And then she goes on to say, never was justice more perfect. Never was civilization higher. And she's talking about the Haudenosaunee. She's talking about the matrilineal, women having that important spiritual position that Michelle described. She is so inspired by the Haudenosaunee that she sees beyond equality to the transformed world that she views with the Haudenosaunee. And at the end of Woman, Church, and State, she says, we note the beginning of the revolution that we're part of. It will proceed. The result of it will be, or in the process of it, every existing institution will be destroyed. The result will be a regenerated world. She envisions the end of the patriarchy of women's oppression, economic oppression, race oppression, the whole, the whole shebang. That's the reason she gets written out of history, I think, because toward the end of the women's suffrage movement, after the merger of the more conservative and the progressive national and the more conservative American Women's Suffrage Association, and the focus singly on the vote, the movement begins to practice racism as policy. They make the argument, give women the vote because white women outnumber Negroes and immigrants, men and women, and women's suffrage is a way to maintain white, native-born supremacy. White supremacy. Now, what are you going to do when you have appealed to the Christian conservatives, where you have appealed to those who want to put God in the Constitution and Jesus Christ as the head of the government, which is a very strong movement. The Women's Christian Temperance Union was behind it. They joined the women's suffrage movement. What are you going to do about a woman who is critical of the Christian church and talks about the superior position of Haudenosaunee women? Want to finish with one last story. Matilda Jocelyn Gage, this same year that she publishes Woman, Church, and State, attempts to vote in her village in Fayetteville, New York, for school commissioner. Now, in 1880, she's been part of the New York Women's Suffrage Association that fought for and won the right for women to vote in school board elections, local. She's pushing the envelope. She attempts to vote in the school commissioner position, to vote for that, which is a state position. She's arrested. She loses the case. The same year, she's given an honorary adoption into the Wolf Clan of the Mohawk Nation. Gage and Gale, you're an honorary adoption. It was, of course, not full, adoption, but she's given a name, a real name, Hoana Howie, and she also writes to her daughter and says, my clan sisters are considering me for a voice on the Council of Matrons in this consensus decision-making process. And that would have given her a voice, she says, in the choosing of the chief, in that decision-making process where everyone takes part. So arrested for voting in her own nation, the same year, she is given an honorary adoption into a Haudenosaunee nation and might have been considered to have a political voice. I rest my case. They were influenced deeply.
Thank you so much, Sally, Michelle. Beautiful, beautiful discussions. I've learned so much. I never tire of the story of the Sky Woman, and I could hear it every day. And I learned a lot, Sally. I've read your books, yet still I learned something new tonight. So thank you very much. I'd like to invite people to write some questions in the question and answer section. And we have one here that you two might be able to answer. Is the matriarchal system the norm for all Indigenous people in North America? We get that question all the time. Who'd like to take that one?
Well, I would say that it's important to understand that our nations, which are throughout the Americas, are all really very, there's definitely groups like the Haudenosaunee, where we have multiple nations that are united together, but we're all really very distinct and different. And not all are, I like to say, matrilineal. Matriarchal has this overtone of a woman leader, sort of as like a queen. And yes, among the Haudenosaunee, we are all queens. We are matrilineal, matrifocal, and yes, the women are in charge, but it's not singular women. It is a collective. And so I can't speak for all nations, and I know that not all follow the same system. So they're really very distinct and different, and you really sort of have to investigate nation by nation in terms of what it is that they follow. And one thing, if it's okay, I'd like to just sort of follow up on a note with where Sally ended, which I think is really critical to our discussion tonight. When you look at history, and you look at the standing of Haudenosaunee women in that same time period that she was just describing, in which Gage and the suffragists were really starting to gain momentum. And, she was out there, publishing about Haudenosaunee women and who we were. At the same time, simultaneously, you see the rights of Haudenosaunee women being pulled away by the US government. And so, if you're curious, why did I never really read about these women before? Why did I not know this history before? It's all interrelated. There has been a silencing of Indigenous voice, and in particular, Indigenous women's voice, because of the fact that we are the ones who are in control of the land. And that's the primary resource that settler, nations and the colonies were seeking to obtain. And so who was in the way of all that? Indigenous women. And here in our territories, Haudenosaunee women in particular. So knowing that there is this type of influence embedded within the US Constitution, why would the founding fathers want that to be known, right? Because then you'd have to really reveal the truth that women are really in charge of that system. And the system really only truly works when women are in charge. It does create that balance that's there. And so slowly but surely that system begins to find its way back. So whenever there's something that reflects our culture, I'm always really very excited about it and being like, yay, United States, you're finding your way back to your original roots. But I did want to say that, that it's really important to understand what happened in that history, in particular from about the 1850s and moving forward, what happened within Haudenosaunee territories, from our children being taken away from us and sent away to boarding schools where they were forcibly removed, taken to schools that were thousands or hundreds of miles away, and were forced to assimilate into white Christian culture, with this motto behind it all that was to kill the Indian and save the man. And these are the only schools for young people anywhere within the country that you will see cemeteries, because a lot of the children didn't survive, right? And so there is this stripping of culture. And then there was also a deliberate hand in switching the roles from the women being in charge of our economies, and being in charge of our agriculture, and taking us into more of a European form of being in the household, and then giving the men the responsibilities that the women had. And it created these levels of trying to of dysfunction, and trying to break down that structure of governance and the way that we operated. So I think that that's also really important to understand, that happened in that same time that women are on the rise for fighting for their right to vote within the country.
And if I might just follow up with that, Michelle, that is so critical. And some of the women who were influenced and inspired by the Haudenosaunee, Alice Fletcher is a case in point. She encouraged, coerced the children of the native nations that she was studying and spending time with. She she was responsible for those children being sent all the way to Carlisle, all the way to Pennsylvania. Some of them never made it back until they were 18 years old. And that systematic beating and sexual violence that has caused the intergenerational post-traumatic stress that is, just endemic. Is Canada has done a better job, I guess, of recognizing that than the United States, and imperfectly, but the public apology for that from the Prime Minister and the compensation for that, you can never undo that damage. But yes, it's that moment, and it is that exact time when the suffragists, the white women, are being inspired by the Haudenosaunee, and at the same time, the push to end that. The Quakers, they're 1845, they held a council with the Seneca, and they said, we've done everything we can to help you save your land, the Buffalo Creek Treaty. We've done everything we can to try to do that, but now we can't do anything more until your women go into the home and your men go into the fields. Publicly, it was in the newspaper. I found an account. So yeah, thank you that's really an important point.
Yes, yes. So I have another question and comment combined, kind of. Leslie asks, why do we call them founding fathers? Maybe we should call them founding men, since father implies some concept of family. Any comments, Sally?
I think Michelle and I are both smiling.
I know.
I will only call them founding men from now on.
I know. I love it. I love it. I want to go with that. I want to go.
How about you, Michelle?
Sure, that sounds good.
I like that. And then we have a question. Thank you, Leslie. That was a good question. Comment. I have a question from my friend Katie. And she asks, she says, thank you for the discussion. And she says, I'm wondering if you could speak on the gender role differences you've observed between Indigenous people and American society.
I didn't quite hear the question, or I could probably see it over here, but.
She says, I'm wondering if you could speak on the gender role differences you've observed between Indigenous people and American society.
Gender role differences?
Yes.
Well, it's interesting. We actually had a talk about that this weekend. I don't know, Gail, if you were sitting in that talk. It's very challenging to answer this question for all Indigenous peoples, right? Because like, again, I said, we're all really very distinct. But one thing that really has, been brought to light and also understood, within many of our nations is that, gender definitely had much more fluidity. And from what I also understand among the Haudenosaunee as well, had much more fluidity. The forced assimilation, with this very sort of heavy hand of Christianity has brought, influences and much more rigidity into our own thinking as peoples, which I acknowledge, exists. But when we look back further into our history and into our stories and even into our language, there are, pronouns that really are neither gender specific. And there's also, stories of, and understandings, and even, for myself growing up, understanding and knowing that, people could really decide for themselves where they wanted to be, whether they wanted to be with the men, whether they wanted to be with the women. Sally talked about responsibilities before when speaking with one of our clan mothers, and responsibilities are something that we all carry. The responsibility to care for our earth, the responsibility to give thanks and appreciation, and to be those stewards of the land. And that's something that all people are supposed to participate in. And so, looking at that, that's in a way in which we're all equal. But then women have certain responsibilities that go back to that story of Sky World that I described earlier. And, like I said, there's so many elements to our creation story and understanding how we are human beings here today. But part of that has to do with when Sky Woman fell from the sky, she grabbed seeds from Sky World that were brought here to this earth that she cultivated. And so what we understand in relationship to women is that those seeds are within us, right? Within our ovaries from the time that we're in our mother's womb, we actually carry our seeds within us. And so there's this direct relationship between seeds, life-giving, the earth being a like the womb of life, and as women being that womb of life-giving, and the seeds and the connection of seeds. So it's a very integrated cosmological view that relates women to this sacred relationship to the earth. And it becomes our men who are the protectors of that. They have to be the protectors of life. It is what also sustains and nourishes them, right? And so we do have these binaries and genders in terms of roles that men and women play within our societies. And I know that a lot of modern feminist views have a hard time, with those binaries. But when you really look at the reasons why that they exist, it's related to a spiritual relationship that all women have to the earth. And when you tend to that and you nurture that, it brings much more nourishment to our lives, right? So knowing that we had those binaries that were there, we also had much more flexibility and freedom to be able to shift wherever you like. So if you as a woman wanted to be with men out hunting or protecting or whatever it is that they did in their part of the world, which was in the woods, women had the right to do that, as well as men had the right to come and be among the women and to be in there in that process of agriculture. And agriculture really is the economy, right? So that's something we need to think about even today in terms of our economy. And so women being in charge of that, we made sure that everybody ate food. It was not based on how much you worked, your education, the amount of labor that you gave. Everybody was fed. We have a concept called one dish, one spoon, which means that when one eats, we all eat. And if there isn't enough, then, we just don't, well, if there's food, we eat. And if there's no food, then nobody eats, right? It's not based on your wealth or your position or your standing. It's that we tend to take care of each other. So there's a lot of fluidity in terms of, role, gender, but there are responsibilities that we all have to tending and taking care of each other. And I think that's really important for us to understand in the world that we're in today.
Very good. Thank you, Michelle.
I gave answers. Sorry about that.
That's a good answer, though. Well, it doesn't matter. It's a good answer. I have two questions that are kind of related. And I think one is from Brianna and one is from Lori. And they're both about reading lists. Brianna's looking as a fourth grade teacher. Is there anything about Indigenous culture that would be useful in teaching white children? And Lori is fascinated with the creation story and is wondering about a reading list. And if I understand correctly, we're going to put together a reading list to send out to all participants. And I do know that there was a Haudenosaunee curriculum created at one time that for some reason is not used in schools, all schools, but I know that it exists. I don't know. Michelle, do you?
Yeah, actually, I do know about it. There were a number of our Haudenosaunee leaders and academics who put together a 600-page curriculum that they had submitted to New York State based on our histories and truth-telling, and New York State rejected it, calling it too controversial. My husband and I actually have a copy of that and are seeking to somehow, bring that out, into the spaces for people to be able to utilize. One thing I really encourage everyone to do, no matter sort of what industry that you work in, is to really think about, how can you incorporate these truths into the spaces that you work in today, right? So if you work in education, right, how can, you help to influence and shape the types of curriculum that's taught in the schools? Or if you can think about, the types of, governing policies that, your company operates under, are they thinking about 7 generations ahead in terms of, the types of outputs and impacts that happen on the world, right? So there's a lot that can be incorporated from Indigenous perspective in today's world, and especially since we're in this great time of change. Now is the opportunity to really begin to look to those narratives, look to those history, look to those ways of thinking and being. So thank you for asking that question about the 4th graders. I know that there's tons of resources that are already being used, and some which I also encourage those of you who are teachers to also reconsider showing any ceremony that's on video, because I know myself, having a 4th grader who went through public school here in New York, that he was shown and demonstrated certain ceremonies that for our people, we would actually say, no, please don't use those anymore. Try to refer to the histories and the stories that we've shared, but when it comes to ceremony, to really consider that being something sacred and special, not to be shared. But and in terms of regarding that curriculum that's out there that was created, maybe you can talk to your school, you can talk to the district, you can talk to the Department of Education, but it exists. So yeah.
If I could add to that, I was one of the second readers on that curriculum, and it is absolutely brilliant. It should be taught in every school. It is beyond New York State. It's a curriculum that could be used nationally. A couple of resources that I found helpful: Debbie Reese is a Native American scholar who has a website in which she evaluates books on Native Americans for young people, for kids too. And I've also really found helpful the North American Traveling College catalog. So
We have quite a bit. So Shailene says, thank you, Sally and Michelle. It's great to have you with us. Sally, to what extent did other first wave Anglo-American feminists of the early 20th century read and engage with Gage's work and her analysis of Indigenous models of matriarchy?
she really was written out of history. Woman, Church, and State stayed in print until I think it went out of print in the teens, and but it was not picked up by feminists really until the 1960s and the second wave. And I have dedicated my life to bringing her back into the world. It's an obsession stalking a dead woman, but I would refer people to, if you're interested, the Matilda Jocelyn Gage .org. It's the Gage home. We've turned it into a center for social justice dialogue. Each of the rooms has one of Matilda Jocelyn Gage's social justice issues. In the first room in the house is, of course, the Haudenosaunee room, where this is where she got her vision of what a transformed world would look like. All of her other work followed from that.
Thank you, Sally. And then I have one, Michelle. This is kind of an easy one. Did Haudenosaunee, this is from Janet, did Haudenosaunee name replace the Iroquois nation that I studied years back?
Okay, so yes, and I'd be so thankful if everybody would start to use Haudenosaunee. However, for research purposes, you will pretty much always have to know the word Iroquois, unfortunately. As I've come to discover the word Iroquois, I've always known that it had a derogatory basis. It was a French word, but I'm also coming to hear that other nations were using this as well in reference to the Haudenosaunee. Oh, excuse, I'm so sorry. Am I still here?
Yes, you're still here.
Okay, I had some strange Zoom message that I'd been signed out. Okay, so yes, Haudenosaunee is how we call ourselves, which means the people of the Longhouse. And so Iroquois actually is a French word that is related to the word of snake. But in addition to that, I'm hearing among some other nations has some other derogatory meanings. And so I'm really encouraging everyone as much as you can, where you see the term Iroquois, to say, actually, they call themselves the Haudenosaunee. And I think we should too. So thank you for asking that question.
Okay, and Kathleen Johns says, with the push for the Green New Deal to protect the Earth, is there also a push for the inclusion of the Indigenous peoples and their knowledge to provide guidance? Seems like without it, we're destined to fail. Good question.
I don't know, Sally, if you want to take that one. I know for myself, actually, I don't know the answer to that question. As Sally had pointed out earlier, the Haudenosaunee took a position that we're not citizens of the United States, but we're citizens of our own nations, and therefore don't participate within the governing process of the United States. So I actually really haven't been paying attention to those. In terms of still being a citizen of my own nation. I do pay attention what's going on out there, but I don't really look into so many of the close details, and especially on this new Green Deal, I don't have much of the details. I don't know if you have that, Sally.
You know, I don't know whether there should be. And I would just say this, that, and this is a personal feeling, that, you know, we have people among us, settler colonialists are among people who have 1,000-year and longer tradition of living in harmony and balance with all of life. And, you know, if we continue along the path that we've had, the Western path of dominance, and you know, that other life forms are commodities, not relatives, that if we continue along that path, we will ensure the end of life on this planet. And the only way that I know that we can survive is that we go through the process of shutting up and listening and learning from the leadership of people who know how to do it.
Very good. Thank you. And then there is another question comment from Lori. Boarding school relocation, the same is true of the Pacific Northwest tribes. The tribes in the Olympic Peninsula had their children sent to Tacoma. I think just about every group.
Yeah, across all of the United States and Canada, this was a process that was sanctioned by both governments in both countries to do this to all nations and tribes across both countries.
And then Broome County Arts Council says thank you to both of you and would like to know if this is recorded and will be shared. And I believe Shelley said it would be. And Deborah is asking, where can we continue to learn more? We're going to send a reading list out, I believe, but also I think, Sally, you mentioned a few places earlier too. So the traveling college, good one. You can get many of our books from there.
I also have a video link that I'll share. I gave a talk for the New York State Museum in the beginning of September. So I can share that link as well that you can put out onto your reading list. And then Sally and I are always talking as well. There's lots of lectures and talks out there that we're both providing.
You know, I also would like to mention a film, the Without a Whisper,
Yes.
done by a Mohawk filmmaker, Junie Fox, and that's available through Women Make Movies, Without a Whisper. And it's on the Haudenosaunee influence on women's rights.
You know, recently I was asked to review a book chapter that talked about teaching Native issues. And it was an update from 10 years ago. And 10 years ago, it said, well, there's really not enough Native literature to, teach a class. 10 years later, we could have a whole curriculum, a whole college degree. Now there's so much literature from every area, from neuroscience to English to any part of it you can think of. So there's plenty. It depends on what topic you want. We'll find something for you.
Right. And in relation to, this particular topic that we're talking about tonight as well, you can also read A Clan Mother's Call by Bear Clan Mother Louise McDonald Hearn. And so that we can add to the list as well.
Yeah, yes. So Rachel says, thank you for this incredible conversation. Michelle mentioned earlier that Haudenosaunee women had autonomy over their own bodies. That's language we often use when talking about reproductive rights. In later years, oops, it's moving. Oh, that was odd. In later years, when women movements in the US were fighting for the right to safe legal abortion, was the wisdom, language, and experience of Indigenous women present in this work? I don't know the answer.
I had trouble hearing that. Could you repeat it?
Okay. So Michelle mentioned earlier that Haudenosaunee women had autonomy over their own bodies. That's language we often use when talking about reproductive rights. In later years, when women movements in the US were fighting for the right to safe legal abortion, was the wisdom, language, and experience of Indigenous women present in that work?
I don't have an answer to that question.
I don't either.
I'm going to make a guess, but I would say that it probably was not.
That would be
but I don't know, Sally, if you have an answer to that.
I can only answer indirectly. And I don't have a direct sense of, or knowledge. I don't have a smoking gun of influence, but listen to the logic of Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Matilda Jocelyn Gage. They said that they believed strongly in the rights of the unborn. And the most sacred right of all was to be wanted and chosen. That every child born should never be an accident or a mistake or forced. And every child born has the right to be welcomed into the world and wanted and chosen. And they said the only way you can ensure that is if a woman has the absolute authority over her own body.
Thank you. And my friend Marie has a question for us. what might the oral histories be about tomorrow and our future, given the current circumstances, as well as ongoing horrific oppression and genocide? What offers hope, equality, and equity? Are there any?
I think that right now what's coming to mind are the words from our Bear Clan mother, Louise MacDonald Hearn, who often likes to be called Mama Bear. And in her book, A Clan Mother's Call, she actually talks about this, where she refers to, colonial settlers as saltwater people, and refers to the saltwater sun, and saying that through the course of time in coming here, that he has worked from his infancy and is now in his adolescence, and hasn't been able yet to find his way, and has caused great devastation and chaos. And now it's time to mature and to make things right. And I know I'm paraphrasing, but that's the essence of what she has written about in her book. And what she talks about is referring to the Indigenous voices of women in particular that hold that language to the land, like in the slide that I pointed to earlier in my talk, and understanding the wisdom that is here, that is really, really very old in terms of being the caretakers of the land, and understanding that there is a process of peace that provides for full equity and inclusion of all voices. Every voice is heard and included. All people are provided for. All people are fed under these laws, and that is under the laws of the Haudenosaunee and under our great laws of peace. And if you remember at the beginning of the presentation, when I showed you the Hiawatha belt as well, as you remember, on the ends of the belt, I pointed out to the white lines that continued beyond the belt. And that was the open doors for people to come and to live within our lands, and to live under this great peace and under these laws and ways of being that are in balance and in harmony with living here as human beings on this planet, Mother Earth. And so those are things that we can look to today. And so I hope that that answers a question.
Thank you. Most of the questions I have right now are really comments and thank yous. I would encourage you, Michelle and Sally, to read these. Many thanks from Shailene. Leanna, thank you. Russell Sage College. Tanya, thank you so much for sharing these stories. They're helpful in situating women's voices across the 19th century. Janet, thank you for clarifying the nation's name change. Although not really a change, just going back to the original, language. She said she studied in the 1980s and 90s, and that's what they taught. And she will make it her mission to educate others. Thank you, Janet.
Wonderful.
Thank you, Janet.
Thank you.
And thank you all for coming to this talk today. I hope you all go away feeling good about what you've learned, and take with you the good positive energy and the good spirit we send to you all. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. I'm so glad you were able to join us tonight, and thank you to the panelists and our moderator for a fascinating conversation. That concludes tonight's event, but please keep an eye out in your emails, and you'll be getting a list of all of the references for further study that were mentioned this evening, and a brief survey that we would appreciate you just taking a couple minutes to fill out. In the meantime, please follow the Women's Institute on Facebook, and we'll look forward to seeing you all next semester. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, ladies.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.
Night. We went over, you guys.
That's